I think we should be fine to start.
I think we're fine to start then. Can I please present to you Edward Shambrook, who's organised tonight, and he will now be presenting his arguments on the other side of the debate. Over to Edward. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Might I just start by making a rather unusual request, actually. Now, before the debate started, you were asked to turn off your mobile phones. And some of you might have done that just now, but turn them back on again. I want everyone here to have access to the internet if they can. Okay? So turn them back on. Might I also just start by thanking Mr. Henshaw and Professor Harriott for joining me here for this debate, as well as the various organisations and individuals who've helped me to organise it. And more importantly, might I just thank Mr. Campbell for being brave enough to testify here today. I am deeply, truly and sincerely sorry for your loss. And if nothing else gets a round of applause tonight, I'd just like to say that I personally wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And it deeply saddens me that you have taken such a position on the matter. I don't know why you've done so, and I'm not going to venture a guess. So to conclude this introduction, I'll just ask all of you, what kind of a world do we live in where a professor can't even use a hint of logic? These people have taken a tragic, world-changing event and then turned it into an episode of 24. And with that much firmly in mind, I've decided that for the purposes of dealing with the claims these people have made, that I'll focus on the film made most recently by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now, this video, for which there's a link, was sent to me by Peter Drew, who helped organise this debate, and is here tonight, actually. And he's obviously very closely aligned with the two gentlemen I'm debating against, otherwise they wouldn't be here. Furthermore, as was suspected, many of the claims as made in that film have been made here today, not least the free-fall myth, which has been spoken of today. Now, I will indeed talk about this video in a moment, but as means of a somewhat inflammatory introduction, I would like to read an email that was written to me by Clive Gale of Alford Technologies. Sidney Alford, the head of the company for which Mr. Gale works, is almost certainly one of the UK's leading experts on explosives. If you don't believe me, feel free to look him up. That's Sidney Alford. And whilst Clive Gale works just underneath him, and I should add that it would seem that these people are pretty interested, perhaps even obsessed with explosives. Even their email domain reads @explosives.net. Now, in my initial email to them, oh, that's Sidney Alford. Looks like quite a character, doesn't he? And in my initial email to them, I asked them about the following ideas. 1. That the fall of Building 7 can only possibly have occurred due to a controlled explosion. 2. That Building 7 fell in free fall, which indicates a controlled explosion. 3. That the North Towers and South Towers fell due to a controlled explosion. And 4. That the official explanations as given by NIST are not adequate explanations for the fall of the three towers. Now, all of these ideas are given within the film, which I'll focus on in a moment. And though my response will hopefully be slightly more thorough, Mr. Gale's was somewhat more succinct and a lot more dismissive. The response to my request reads, Dear Edward, I'm not sure who else in our technical department will offer an opinion or have time to answer, but here's a general overview. There's nothing quite like a good conspiracy theory, and this one has certainly done the rounds. I was with the Ministry of Defence serving in Saudi Arabia at the time of 9/11, and I can tell you that this particular conspiracy theory, and many other outrageous theories, were circulating amongst the locals the day after the main event. It was pretty obvious at the time that the various jihadist websites were primed, ready to go. There were many who rightly condemned the attack, but sadly there were also many who chose to believe that, quote, none of the Jews went to work that day, Mossad was responsible, the CIA blew up the towers as an excuse for a war against Islam, unquote, and so on. Let's face it, if you are the type of person who's prepared to believe that sort of thing, then you might also believe in pixies. From a pure explosive demolition perspective, to drop a large building without spreading it over a large area is a very specialist job which requires a lot of prior planning and preparation. To drop a modest tower block can often take several weeks or months of planning, and the necessary preparations are all very visible. Something on the scale of the Twin Towers would be a massive undertaking. Furthermore, the skill sets required to do this type of job are not readily available to the intelligence agencies, brackets, apart from in Hollywood movies, close brackets. This fact alone would require this very covert operation to be subcontracted out. Then they would have to sneak into the various tower buildings, drill thousands of holes and expose the various critical structures. This means using specialist types of silent hammer drills and smokeless burning equipment. Then they would have to fit the many explosive charges, make all the connection runs, etc., and all whilst the buildings were in use. They must have been good, because nobody witnessed anything unusual. Maybe the CIA hired a pixie demolition company who could make themselves invisible. The next phase would be to find suitable pixie suicide squads who were prepared to hijack the aircraft and crash it into the buildings without damaging any of your controlled demolition setup. By now, I hope you get my point. There are people in this world who just want to believe in this sort of nonsense, and no matter how logical the counter-argument is, they will never change their opinion. Thankfully, demolition companies and military organisations do not generally employ such weak-minded individuals. However, if you do happen to find an invisible pixie demolition company, please let us know. We can make a fortune. Best regards, the tech team. Very well said. And Sidney Alford himself concurred, saying, "Dear Edward, I'm afraid that I have to concur with my colleagues on this one. Now, had you been inquiring about the strange death of Dr. David Kelly, or indeed of Robin Cook, at about the same time, I believe that there might be more murk surrounding the official interpretations. Yours sincerely, Sidney Alford." So yeah, that's the introduction. Now, it does seem to be worth saying that I don't actually agree with Dr. Alford about the deaths of Dr. David Kelly or of Robin Cook, although you could perhaps argue that these particular theories wouldn't require the same level of government collaboration and corroboration that the 9/11 conspiracy would, but I'm digressing, of course. Bill Meyer, pictured, host of Real Time with Bill Meyer, may have actually had a point when he made this statement live on his TV show entitled Real Time with Bill Meyer. I'll just let that load for a second.
While we're on the subject, new crazy people who still think the government brought down the Twin Towers in a controlled explosion have to stop pretending that I'm the one who's being naive. How big a lunatic do you have to be to watch two giant airliners packed with jet fuel slam into buildings on live TV, igniting a massive inferno that burned for 2 hours, and then think, well, if you believe that was the cause. Stop asking me to raise this ridiculous topic on the show and start asking your doctor if Paxil is right for you.
I couldn't agree more. Now, without further delay, allow me to analyse the film by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, which is based on countless logical fallacies, I can tell you. One of my favourites is when they say that the fact that the collapse of WTC-7 looks just like a controlled explosion is in itself smoking gun evidence that it was indeed a controlled explosion. Now, call me a simpleton, but the last time I checked, looks like and is are very different things. Now, you're probably wondering, why on earth would he show a picture of Matt Smith right now? But there is an important point to be made here, don't you worry. Believe it or not, I've actually been told by a few people that I actually look like Matt Smith. Do you see it? I don't personally, but some people do. And this is a comment that I'm actually particularly flattered by. He's a wonderful actor and a pretty handsome man, I may say. But there is nevertheless a simple fact that must be stated here. I'm not Matt Smith. The fact that I look like Matt Smith isn't smoking gun evidence that I am in fact Matt Smith. I think you get the point. And don't forget, even if the fall of WTC-7 did indeed look like a controlled explosion, it most certainly didn't sound like one. Explosions are, after all, unmistakably and undeniably, by their nature, extremely noisy. Basically, in every controlled explosion that has ever taken place, some of which were shown by Professor Harriet, you hear quite a few loud bangs and then the building falls down straight after, but apparently not in this case, apparently. Barry Jennings, pictured, was a survivor of these attacks. 5 hours before the attacks, he says that he was running down the stairs to get out of Building 7. Sorry, 5 hours before the fall of Building 7. He says that as he was running down the stairs to get out of Building 7, he heard some large explosions. Now, these were heard 5 hours before the collapse of the towers. To a simpleton like me, this doesn't really seem particularly shocking, seeing as a skyscraper was about to fall down next door, yet they see this as smoking gun evidence of a controlled explosion. And don't take my word for it that they're talking garbage here. Even Barry Jennings himself has gone on record to say that he feels highly misrepresented by the conspiracy theories. He made this point in the same documentary that I pointed that. No, I didn't. He made this in a BBC documentary. In fact, that photo actually comes from that BBC documentary where he said this. I regret that I don't have the time to show you this clip, but you can watch it in your own time by simply putting in those search terms into YouTube and skipping to around 46 minutes in. So, as you can see, not only are these theories based on countless logical fallacies, they're also based on quite simple untruths. The film also suggests that after the fall of the buildings, the area was sealed off and nobody touched, that's a quote, nobody touched the buildings from the materials from Building 7. And they see this as being of major significance, but it's not true. In fact, hundreds of firefighters sorted through the wreckage of Building 7 after the collapse. And guess what? Absolutely no evidence of explosives was found at the scene by firefighters. You would have thought that finding just 1 centimetre of the 5 miles worth of demolition wiring that would have been required would have been a pretty easy task, but apparently not according to the folks featured in that film. And even their justifications for why these attacks were supposedly orchestrated by the US government are ill-researched to the point where, quite frankly, it almost borders on pure idiocy. Only the other day, my good friend John Thompson, who's actually on Skype with me right now, he analysed the idea that the attacks were orchestrated for economic gain. But as he very correctly pointed out, the physical damage to the towers itself cost the US economy $55 billion. And the wider economic impact was a staggering $123 billion. And this isn't even mentioning the costs of war. Homeland security in itself cost $589 billion. War funding cost $1,649 billion, and veteran spending $867 billion. The combined costs of these damages mounted to $3.3 trillion, which was one of the most significant reasons why the US deficit stands at such a disastrous rate today. From a government perspective, therefore, it seems highly unlikely that to place such a high economic burden on the US would be undertaken deliberately. But the conspiracy theorist interjects. Perhaps it was carried out by a select few elite who didn't actually care about the state of the US economy. Perhaps these elite only cared about geopolitically positioning the US in the Middle East and Central Asia to gain access to oil in Iraq and rare earth materials in Afghanistan. This allegation is, in my opinion, unbelievably ignorant. For this allegation is so easily answered. This link, which I'm uploading, it's a report by The Economist as well as other on the ground reporting by Vice magazine, indicate that the Iraq oil infrastructure is still in the dumps after the war. So much so, in fact, that $140 billion now needs to be spent on the required infrastructure in Iraq by 2035. And you can see the article there, so if you want to go and look it up, feel free. And it's not even like foreign oil companies made a hugely significant profit. British businesses did indeed make £1.1 billion in the region, and this may sound a lot, but it's hardly significant considering the aforementioned costs of war, etc. And that last figure doesn't come from the Ministry of Defence or from any other government publication, nor does it come from any sector of the mainstream media. It actually comes from an anti-war movement that would have had every incentive to find evidence of a conspiracy. And there it is. Feel free to look it up. Now, given all of these figures, does it really seem logical that George Bush, or indeed any other political person and or factor, would risk political and economic ruin, impeachment, imprisonment, and possibly even the death penalty for completely insignificant gain? Wouldn't it have been a hell of a lot easier just to enter into an honest contract? But even if their theories are illogical, they're at least rooted in science, right? Actually, no. Several outrageous scientific claims are made in that film that I mentioned earlier. My personal favourite is, I'm not making this up, the idea that when the planes hit the North Tower, quote, the majority of the jet fuel burnt up in a big fireball and then it was gone. How I'd love to see Professor Harriott, a fully qualified scientist at a reputable, accredited institution, defend this idea. It would surely be nothing short of a YouTube classic.
I will.
Go for it. And speaking of Professor Harriott, he may sound sciencey on this issue, and yet neither he or Mr. Henshaw can give me any logical explanation as to how they got the demolition equipment there in the first place. Perhaps they did it in the dead of night, the conspiracy theorist says. Folks, get real. New York is known for being the city that never sleeps, and it's no coincidence that this complex was known as the World Trade Center. Witnesses would have been in abundance. And some, such as Richard Gage, head of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, an organisation which both of our guests here today are affiliated with, have gone one insane step further by suggesting that the explosives were secretly planted at the time the building was actually constructed in the 1980s. Mr. Gage claimed this in a BBC documentary, the link and title of which is shown there. Now, in that film, Mr. Loiseau, who's a demolition expert, profoundly pointed out that explosives have a shelf life of 3 years, which in itself debunks the claims made by Mr. Gage. But this doesn't even mention the total lack of logic behind Mr. Gage's position. As my good friend John Thompson rightly pointed out when helping me prepare for this debate, the geopolitical situation in the 1980s, which is the time when the towers were constructed, was completely and utterly different from the late 90s and early 2000s. And I would address that, but I'm going to move on because I'm a little conscious of time. Also, is it not noteworthy that, according to Gage, this conspiracy has actually passed through different presidential administrations? And don't think that this practice of implicating anyone and everyone is a rare thing for 9/11 conspiracy theorists to do. I'll give you a list of just some of the organisations that have, at some point, been implicated either by Professor Harriot or by Mr. Henschel themselves, or by conspiracy theorists very closely affiliated with them. Now, I'll repeat that. The following is a list of just some of the organisations that have, at some point, been implicated by Professor Harriot or by Mr. Henschel or by those conspiracy theorists very closely affiliated with them. Individuals within the NSA, individuals within the CIA, individuals within the FBI, the Bush Jr. administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush Sr. administration, the Reagan administration, other Republicans, other Democrats, individuals within the US Army, the US Air Defense Agency, Halliburton, the BBC, the CBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, Larry Silverstein, NIST, the 9/11 Commission, the US State Department, the Pentagon, the Flight 77 crew, the Flight 77 passengers, the United 93 crew, the United 93 passengers, the list goes on and on and on. In short, their unofficial motto appears to be, if you can't beat them, implicate them. I thus take it as something of a compliment that even I was implicated by a conspiracy theorist who actually may be present here today, although it's worth saying that this man isn't actually aligned with either of these gentlemen. I was said to be in allegiance with the James Randi Educational Foundation, which I'm a great admirer of, and William Rodriguez, who I don't admire, to spread disinfo about the truth behind 9/11. However, it seems worth stating that even this is nowhere near the most outlandish allegation he made, nor was his allegation that Harriot and Henschel themselves were spreaders of disinfo. Amazingly, it would now seem that certain conspiracy theorists are even implicating each other. Now, to go back to talking about Professor Harriot, it is also worth saying that not only is he illogical in his thinking, in this issue, it would seem he's also quite incompetent in his scientific practice, at least in regards to this issue. And yes, this comes in spite of his title and his position. Now, I'm not a scientist, nor do I claim to be. So, in line with good academic practice, I asked for an opinion from someone who is. Andrew Patterson, a 22-year-old physics graduate from the University of Oxford, and admittedly an old friend of mine, was so amused by the scientific paper, as written by Professor Harriot, which was sent to me by Peter Drew, and others, that he had quite a lot to say. The following is a partial transcript of a conversation I had with him on Facebook, of all places. Though you may say that it's hardly an academic source, Facebook, it's nevertheless useful that evidence of the conversation can be readily provided should I be asked for it. He said, quote, "Well, straight away I've never heard of the Open Chemical Physics Journal," which is where it was published. And I would say that in terms of scientific papers, physics journals would be limited to new techniques that could be used to do these kinds of investigations, rather than reports on actual investigations themselves. Some of this gets quite technical, or it sounds technical, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. Andrew later continued, "Okay, so I've scanned through most of it. It seems like their experimental techniques come down to three major things. One, they've looked at the sample with an electron microscope, brackets, which is literally just a way of imaging small things, close brackets. Two, some form of X-ray spectroscopy. What I'd have to say about all of the X-ray spectroscopy is that it's based around energetic transitions of electrons in an atom. So normally what you'd have on those graphs, where they've just labelled oxygen, iron next to the peaks, is much more detailed information specifying the precise electron transitions. That's what I'd expect in a serious scientific paper anyway. So when they say, oh, look, this peak is iron, what I'd really expect them to say is that this peak is consistent with the K-alpha line of iron. And then you go away and look up what the K-alpha line of iron is. And that might be the energy to free an electron from the first electron orbital of iron. But there may be other lines in other elements which have very similar energies. So basically, I would expect much more detailed analysis of exactly why they came to the conclusion that the peak is iron, what exact electron transition in iron the peak corresponds to, and whether or not there are any other elements that could give similar peaks. 3. The third experimental technique they use is calorimetric, which as far as I understand is just where you heat something up to a certain temperature and see what energy comes out. So if it ignites at 400 degrees, as they say, then yeah, you'd expect the peak on the graph at 400 degrees. So what they do here is compare the data they get from the calorimetric of their sample to thermite. They don't actually compare it to any inert substances at all. But presumably we are to assume that inert substances show a flat line here. I don't know if that's a valid assumption or not. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the actual experiments they do. Then they go on this discussion bit where they ask very biased questions such as, could the material be not very unreacted superthermite? Realistically, what they should be trying to do is make no assumptions about what the material is and then use analysis methods to determine what the compound is. But what they seem to have done is decided what it is, then do experiments and see if the data could possibly agree. Anyway, by the end of it, what they've basically concluded is that these red chips are superthermite. But what I'd expect someone to do, if they were serious about this, is compare samples of the dust to control samples, so samples of buildings built from similar materials that they know have fallen down naturally, brackets, or at least without the use of superthermite, close brackets. And also compare samples of the dust to buildings that have been destroyed with use of explosives. At the very least, they need to make some attempt to confirm whether or not the conditions in the disaster could create such a compound. This is the key bit. Basically, I am rambling because there is so much wrong with it, I could talk all day. And I don't know who these people are, but even the ones who work in universities don't have doctor or professor in front of their name. Are they just lab staff? People that get paid to work in science labs who don't have degrees in physics or chemistry or similar and operate machinery and the like? As far as chemical analysis goes, it looks really basic to me. I'm not a chemist, but just using X-ray spectroscopy to work out the percentage compositions of elements is pretty simplistic. There are lots of techniques you can use to work out specific bonds present in materials, so you can become more certain of what is within a compound, or what its structure is at least. I don't know what the WTC was built out of, but the fact there's iron and aluminium involved in a flake of dust doesn't strike me as wildly suspicious. But they seem very certain this is thermite for people who have only done rudimentary analysis of its composition and then burnt some to see if it burns. Also, the whole thing with, we better make sure it's not just paint, makes me rather suspicious. So they essentially put it in a paint solvent and see what happens to it. I'm pretty sure if you give a chemist an unidentified compound and ask them to work out what it is, they don't first try to divide it into a group of paint or non-paint. So as scientific papers go, it isn't one. But as evidence of there actually being thermite in these samples goes, you can't ignore what they found completely. Interesting. But they don't seem to be qualified experts in the field. If I were you, I would Google their names and see what you can find out about them, which I was actually going to do, but then, as you'll see later, he kind of beat me to it. So I then said, thank you so much for that. Just one final thing. When I was sent this paper by a conspiracy theorist, and this sounds technical, but again, it's not really, he said, quote, the challenge for debunking what they have examined in the WTC dust requires denying the validity of the sample, i.e. they faked the sample material, ad hominem attack of paper authors, and or coming up with a simpler yet sufficient explanation for what is in all the samples. None that I have read met these criteria. So what this man was basically saying, I think it was Mike Berger, who's for 911truth.org, what he's basically saying is that in order to be able to explain away this paper, you've got to suggest that there was there's a more reasonable explanation, or that they're just lying. That's what he's saying. I asked Andrew, what would your response be to that? To which he then responded, well, as far as sample integrity goes, I've just assumed everywhere they didn't do that. Of course, if they fake the sample, they can get whatever results they want. As for the ad hominem stuff, it seems like some of the authors are really unqualified for what they're doing here. One seems to be an architect, and another is a software engineer, which to me sounds a bit like trusting your shoe polisher to do eye surgery, but there you go. If that's considered an ad hominem attack by your friend, then so be it. But if someone is unqualified, you don't trust their judgments unless an expert can confirm them. As far as nobody being able to come up with simpler explanations for the presence of these materials, I'm sure whoever did a real investigation into how the towers fell down would have considered any evidence they deemed useful. I'm sure they'll disagree with me on that one. So, for example, during the construction of the towers, you might have lots of different compounds being used. Could any of them resemble this composition of material? They don't even attempt to answer that question in this scientific paper. The fact is, it's just not a scientific paper. It's already come to its conclusion, and it makes a concerted effort to prove it throughout. There is literally no discussion of other compounds that might give similar results. He later went on, I just want to add that I'm in no way an expert on anything I've just commented on. I just think their approach seems extremely biased, which is generally unscientific. That would be my biggest criticism. And then he went on a bit later, I find it easy to have sympathy for these theories. Interesting, you might say. When you read something like that, it all seems very convincing. Right now, I am still wondering what the flakes are. So I was intrigued by that, and I said to him, well, one explanation given was a fire extinguisher, or just red paint. And indeed, I didn't just pull this explanation out my backside. A BBC article entitled, you can look this up if you like, it's entitled 9/11 Conspiracy Theories, How They've Evolved. 9/11 Conspiracy Theories, How They've Evolved. And it does indeed state that, brackets, there is an alternative explanation for the thermitic material the sceptical scientist found in the dust. It's just a type of primer paint. After pointing out this alternative explanation, the conversation continued, and he said, well, the only real thing that gives it credibility to being the remnants of an explosive is the colorimetric thing. I just feel more at ease if an explosives expert could look at it and just be like, nah, don't worry, that doesn't prove it's an explosive. But the problem with this sort of thing, and this is interesting, but the problem with this sort of thing, do pardon my French on this, is always that there are more people who can produce shit than there are experts to discredit it. Interesting, you might say. And that was the point at which I decided to contact Dr. Alford, the letter I said earlier. And short of believing that Pixies set up the explosives, I don't think he was really supportive of Professor Harriot or Mr. Henschel either. When I started preparing for the debate a few months ago, I was determined to focus entirely on the issues at hand and to avoid engaging in any form of profile assassination. Unfortunately, the opportunity to do so was a little too tempting, although it is relevant. What I want to prove here is that he's not that he's an anti-Semite in any case, but that he does draw from irresponsible sources and that he can be very irresponsible. I do not regard you as an anti-Semite in any sense. Henschel also reiterates his suspicion that Mossad, which is a Jewish intelligence agency, is in some way involved in 9/11. Now, don't get me wrong. As I keep saying, I'm not here to accuse Mr. Henschel of being an anti-Semite. I do not regard him as an anti-Semite. He has on numerous occasions appeared on a radio show hosted by Dr. Kevin Barrett. And he's that man state there.
Can I point out
And indeed,
here-
Peter Drew, no, I'm sorry.
Can I have been told from the other side here that this article is not true and there are libel cases involved. in
Okay.
this.
Well,
Okay,
with that,
just to
well,
point
I'm
out.
only going on the
Okay,
information that
thank
I've got, okay?
You're
I'm going on-
repeating the libel.
I'm-
As a lawyer, you know what that means.
I'm going-
You're repeating the libel. That's fine.
I'm just saying the article that I've got there, Mr. Henschel, okay? And indeed, Peter Drew, the man who organised this debate and who, sorry, you might just have to bear with me. But he has actually appeared on a radio show hosted by Dr. Kevin Barrett. To conclude, might I also say that despite Mr. Campbell's testimony, they do not represent most of the survivors or the families of the victims. As a part of the extensive research that I've done in the course of writing this play, I contacted Project Rebirth, an organisation which aids the families of the numerous victims of the 9/11 families. I was told in no uncertain terms by Donna Gaffney that, quote, most 9/11 families simply roll their eyes when they hear about the conspiracy theories. The 9/11 Survivors Network was far more dismissive and a lot more offended. The man who responded to me initially, who I won't name because he doesn't ordinarily like to associate with the theorists in any shape or form, had this to say, quote, personally, I'm as disgusted with the truthers as you are. I should point out that I was no big fan of the Bush administration myself. I thought they totally dropped the ball before 9/11 and their errors allowed that horrible day to happen. But there is no way in hell I think they could or would have pulled off such a conspiracy. I've been approached several times by truthers looking for some validation from somebody who was there. But when I point out that I saw things with my own eyes that directly contradict the things they believe in, they just move on. And I think you described it perfectly how they behaved. They treat it like it was a Hollywood movie and they figured out the secret plot, thus making them geniuses while the rest of the country is a bunch of idiots. And they do this with total disregard for those they may be hurting, those who were there and or those who lost somebody. He wasn't alone in his convictions. Brian Branco, who's another 9/11 survivor, was kind enough to write a letter as per my request that I could include within my play. And though the first line is mine, the rest is all him. This is what he had to say. Dear so-called truthers, I personally find it appalling that you would even think the United States government would carry out an attack and kill 2,977 innocent people on September 11th, 2001. I've heard your stories that there are no planes. The people from the planes are still alive. Hundreds of sticks of dynamite were used to take down WTC-7. Everyone in our country has the freedom of speech, but there is a time and place for everything. I will never forget on the second anniversary of the facts, you're walking around screaming and yelling that Bush killed your children with your sign. Yeah, it was pretty funny that once I started yelling back and would not back down, that you decided to go somewhere else. You got no help from the NYC police because while you have the freedom of speech, there is a time and a place for everything. I knew and the NYC police knew that September 11, 2003 was neither the time or the place to spew your lies. You stand outside the Pal station, which is right next to the site, and try to get people to listen to your lies. How many times do I have to come and fight with you so you will leave? You stand there with a video camera for what purpose? To show that you need to film stuff when things don't go your way? It's funny, I'm grabbing you and grabbing your camera, and the NYC police are just sitting in their cars watching and laughing because they know how stupid you look to the world. If I got the camera, I would have destroyed it. All of your theories have been debunked. The next section is mostly just a repeat of what I've said, so I'll skip that section. He goes on, all your conspiracy theories are just plain wrong. Mr. Branco very well said. Thank you for listening.